Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'd like to start this evening with our land acknowledgement. And I'm aware that many of you may be joining from the traditional lands of many Indigenous people. I ask you to consider an appropriate acknowledgement for the lands upon which you find yourself. I'm on the campus at York University, so I shall read our land acknowledgement from here. York University recognises that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huon-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lake region. Thank you very much, everybody, and welcome. My name is Robert Savage. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Education, and I'm delighted to be here for the second in our public lecture series from York tonight. And I shall be introducing our speaker in just a moment. But before we do, I'd like to thank all those who are coming in the audience. I'm aware that a number of you have come in from different school boards and parents and teachers and have many complex, multifaceted connections to the world of education. We have teachers and educators from school boards across the province here tonight, deans of faculties of education, directors of education, members of the Ontario College of Teachers, the Ministry of Education, amongst the Ministry of Colleges and Universities, members of York's Teaching Education Advisory Committee, Ontario Human Rights, and the Council of Ontario Universities will have representation, amongst many others. You're all very welcome here tonight, and you're delighted that you're able to come. I'm going to say a few words about the format of the presentations tonight. The session will be recorded and will be made available after the event. A live transcript feature, which you may already be able to see, is available for participants for accessibility purposes. The feature is generally very good, but it's not perfect, so that some of the words are not always transcribed perfectly, so I ask you to be aware of that. There will be a Q&A session afterwards, and I'll ask all participants to put their questions in the Q&A after the presentation. And if we cannot get to all the questions, please feel free to contact us by email at edudean@edu.yorku.ca. I'm pleased to say also that tonight's talk is being simulcast on Voice Ed Radio. Now simply go to the link that I'll be placing in the chat, voiced.ca, VOICED.ca, and access the live button there. So thank you for that. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. Dr. Winton is a critical educational researcher, educational policy researcher and associate professor in the Faculty of Education at York University, co-director of the World Educational Research Association's International Research Network on families, educators, and communities as educational advocates. She studies policy, advocacy, influences, and enactment. She's the author or co-author of close to 50 articles and book chapters. She's prolific. She's the co-editor of the 2020 book, Critical Perspectives on Education Policy in Schools, Families and Communities, with Dr. Gillian Craig, our Canada Research Chair in Disability Studies in Education at York. And she's the author of a forthcoming book, Unequal Benefits, Privatization and Public Education in Canada, University of Toronto Press. Her current SSHRC-funded research examines struggles over public funding of private schools in Canada. In this talk, Dr. Sue Winton will draw on her book, Unequal Benefits, Privatization and Public Education in Canada, the University of Toronto Press, to explain how growing education privatization is undermining public education and democracy. Specifically, she will show how policies such as fundraising, fees, and specialized schools and programs, amongst others, enable some children to accumulate more advantages from public education than others, often thereby reproducing patterns of social inequity and inequality that exist outside of schools. She will then discuss ideas for resisting educational privatization and strengthening public education's commitments to equity, inclusion, open decision-making processes, and thereby the collective good. It's my enormous pleasure to welcome for you, Dr. Sue Winton, and I'm sure she's going to give an extremely interesting presentation, which will hand over to you, Sue, from here. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you, Dean Savage, for the introduction. I'd also like to thank our moderator, Dr. Behan Farhadi. She will be moderating the questions to follow my talk. I'd also like to thank Aisha Patel for all her support behind the scenes, and to Steve Hurley at Voice Ed Radio for live streaming this talk. And I'd like to welcome everyone. What a crowd. I'm so glad that you're joining me here tonight. And I'm very happy to be talking about education privatization with you. Although, on the other hand, wouldn't it be great if we just didn't have anything to talk about regarding this topic? In any case, that's not the situation. So I'm just going to turn on my slides here so we can kick off this discussion. So I just want to give you an overview of the next 45 minutes or so, what you can expect. I'm going to begin by telling you about me, so you know where I'm coming from. I'm going to talk about education privatization. What do I mean when I say that? Then I'm going to talk about some examples of privatization of public education and privatization in public education in Canada. And I'm going to close by talking about some ways that we could recommit to public education. So a little bit about me. Some you've already heard from Dr. Savage, but like he said, I study education policy. I'm really interested in how people and organizations advocate for a particular policy option. I'm interested in how policies and their meanings change over time. I'm interested in how policy is enacted and why does the same policy look different in different places. But especially as a critical policy researcher, I'm interested in answering two questions about any policy. That is, who are its winners and who are its losers? So you've already heard a bit about my CV. I've published a lot of articles and book chapters. I've co-edited a few books, and my book, Unequal Benefits, Privatization and Public Education in Canada, was published just this week, hot off the press. But before all of that, I grew up in Scarborough, Ontario. I attended public schools there in Scarborough, as well as in the former city of Toronto. I began my career as an elementary school teacher. I've taught in Mexico, the USA, and Canada. I'm also the mom of 3 sons, all of whom graduated from the Toronto District School Board. So I've given a lot of time and attention to education from multiple vantage points. As a teacher and as a parent, I've been really frustrated with policies and practices that call me to do things that I don't agree with, but that I find hard to resist. Things like participating in school fundraising, paying for my children to join school sports teams, or choosing between different high school programs. I've spent the last 10 years or so conducting research on outcomes of school district and government policies that privatize public education. So tonight I'm going to draw on those studies, as well as the work of a lot of other researchers inside and outside of academia. Some of them I think might be here on this call tonight. And I'm going to argue that our public education systems in Canada need a change of course. We need to move away from policies that are privatizing our public education systems and towards those that create opportunities for all children, families, and communities to benefit equally from public schools. So, of course, there's a big country in Canada, and as you know, every province and territory has its own policies and practices regarding public education. So while I'm going to do my best to point to examples from across Canada, I will be drawing on a lot from Ontario, in part because that's what I know, and in part because there's actually quite limited research on privatization of public education in the Canadian context. There's a lot of variation. So of course, some of the points that I mentioned, I know will not be relevant to all jurisdictions. And like I said, there's a need for a lot more knowledge about what is going on in schools across Canada, especially now as we're in this changing context, not quite post-pandemic, that's for sure, but certainly hoping to see the end sometime soon. So now, what is education privatization? What am I talking about here? Well, I know that when many people hear that term privatization, they think about the wholesale transfer of a public service or a public good over, like, from the public sector, to the private sector. And of course, that is one meaning of privatization. But it's not what I'm talking about tonight when I'm talking about the privatization of public education. Instead, I'm drawing on the work of Ball and Udell and Lubienski to talk about three different kinds of education privatization. So one of those is the privatization of public education, sometimes called exogenous privatization. And really what that means is bringing the private sector into public schools. And this happens in different ways. It can mean that private actors take on roles and responsibilities that were formerly provided by governments or school boards. Sometimes those responsibilities can include funding schools, building and maintaining school infrastructure, delivering education, governing schools, creating policy, and other possibilities. I also wanted to say that tonight, when I talk about private actors, I'm talking about a wide range of non-government actors, including religious institutions, community-based organizations, philanthropists, foundations, parents, caregivers, as well as businesses in some cases. So privatization of public education also does include policies and practices that enable the private sector to profit from their involvement in public education. And this can happen when public money is used to buy materials and services, and when businesses are allowed to market or sell or otherwise benefit from their products' placements in schools. So a second type of education privatization includes policies that bring ideas, practices, and values of the for-profit sector into public education. Ball and Udell call these processes and programs as privatization in public education, or endogenous privatization. And really, there's two key complementary strategies that facilitate this kind of privatization. So one major strategy, involves governing the public sector using practices that are common in the private sector, using initiatives such as standards or performance measures, targets, and results. And often people refer to this approach as new public management. Doesn't feel that new anymore, but in any case, in education, new public management policies and practices include things like standardized curricula, large-scale assessments, graduation rate targets, and public school rankings, among others. The second major strategy that constitutes privatization in public education is that the efforts to organize education systems as a market. So just think like any other marketplace, it involves customers choosing between products based on different kinds of information, as well as their own preferences, needs, and resources. And in a market, of course, we know that sellers compete with one another as they create desired and unique products of different quality, and they market them to consumers. So taking that idea and applying it to education, the products, of course, are these unique specialized schools or programs or other kinds of options that consumers or the customers are parents and families and their children. And the information that they use to inform their choices includes those sort of outputs of new public management, including graduation rates, standardized test scores, school rankings, and others as well. But the third kind of privatization I just want to highlight is produced sort of by the combination of privatization in and of public education. And that's when people start to see public education as really primarily about accruing their own individual benefits, as opposed to pursuing or prioritizing what was good for the greater good of society. And that the view that education is really about, getting the best that I can for me and my child, primarily, of course, it's always present, but primarily really does begin to impact what people expect from schools for themselves, and of course, what they're willing to allow and tolerate for others. As I'm going to show in the next half hour or so, the privatization of public education definitely offers advantages to some individuals, families, and groups. However, generally, education privatization is known to produce and reproduce patterns of social inequality and undermine democracy. So how does privatization happen? Well, in 2017, researcher Anthony Verger and some of his colleagues did an extensive literature review and identified different paths to privatization. They determined that Canada, like the US, has followed what they call the path of scaling up privatization. So they describe that as the steady accumulation of reforms over time that ultimately change public education systems in significant, but not necessarily linear ways. However, when they did their research, they also identified a sixth path, and that is privatization by way of catastrophe or by emergency. What they found is that crises create the conditions for education privatization to accelerate and proliferate. And so some of these conditions include new or enhanced opportunities for private actors to be present, to influence and test new ideas in public education. This happens in part because people's sense of urgency to return to normal that they experience following a crisis, as well as sometimes their preoccupation of just surviving, just getting through it, means that transparent and democratic debates are less likely to take place. And as a result, controversial policies can be introduced more easily. And finally, they note that reforms that are adopted during or post a crisis really tend to last. They last beyond the time and location of the event. So Verger and colleagues point to the case of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans as a prime example. They explained that the need to quickly rebuild schools following the hurricane made the public open to policies that privatized education that, in fact, many citizens had resisted prior to the hurricane. It was also harder for those opposed to the reforms to get organized because, in fact, many of them were displaced by the storm. So before I turn to present some evidence that education systems in Canada are privatizing, and consider some ways that the pandemic may be impacting the process, I just want to take a few minutes to talk about public education. That is what I think we should be striving towards. Now, not everyone defines public education or public schools in the same way. And in fact, I would argue that we are in the midst of a struggle over the very meaning of the word public. For some people, the public in public education refers only to where the money comes from to pay for education. And certainly this is what a lot of advocates of public funding for private schools argue. But for me, public education refers to systems of schooling that are characterized by some commitments that have been summarized by John Young and some colleagues. These commitments include universal access, that is, that everyone of school age can attend. Furthermore, that the costs involved in schooling are paid for by the government, so that a family's ability to pay does not impact the quality of schooling that a child receives. Furthermore, all students have equal opportunity to reap the benefits of public schooling. Also, that in terms for public education, decisions should be made in public and through public political processes. And finally, public education should serve the public interest and prioritize collective benefits of education. Now, I know that what counts as the public interest is debated. But again, for me, it means that in part that public schooling should prioritize public benefits, which include things like preparing young people for the roles and responsibilities of democratic citizenship, providing them with opportunities to learn how to live peacefully with people who are different from themselves. They should foster concern for the environment and climate change. They need to create a workforce that can pay taxes and meet the needs of the economy. They need to do things that can help the public stay healthy, and importantly, to aim to prepare young people, to transform the world. And so in this talk, I'm going to refer to any school that contains all of these features as one that reflects the public school ideal. But of course, I want to acknowledge that few, if any, schools have ever met this ideal. I'm not looking to return to some golden age where public schools achieved all of these things, but instead, this is the ideal. Instead, we know that since their beginnings, Canada's public schools have always benefited some groups more than others. They've provided far more advantages to white, English, and French-speaking, able-bodied, and middle and upper-class children and communities than they have to children from low-income families, disabled, Indigenous, Black, and other racialized families and communities. So I know that our public schools must change in order to serve all children well, but I believe that they remain our best hope for democracy. And so while I want to acknowledge that achieving the public school ideal is going to require a lot more than just rejecting education privatization, it does involve doing this as part of our efforts. So now I'm going to turn to some examples of privatization of public education in Canada. I'm going to begin by looking at some policies that encourage private actors to take on roles and responsibilities in public education that were formerly taken on by governments or school boards. Okay, first I want to talk about school fundraising. And I'm going to talk locally, that is at the school level, fundraising by parents, community members, teachers, and students. And I, of course, want to acknowledge that school fundraising is not new, but certainly over the last few decades, there's been the need or the perceived need or the absolute need to fundraise, and the scale of fundraising has increased over time. Almost every school, at least in Ontario, fundraises. According to a 2019 survey of over 1,200 public schools conducted by the group People for Education, which is an education organization in Ontario, according to them, that survey, 99% of elementary and 89% of secondary schools in the province fundraise. And they do it in a lot of different ways. So, for example, they sometimes sell books, the book fair, or magazine subscriptions, cookie dough, wreaths, pizza, freezies. These are just some of the things that I can think of right off the top of my head from my own experience as a parent. Also, some schools host events. They can include parent social events, fun fairs, movie nights, working at casinos in some places. And sometimes these events are connected to other forms of fundraising. which includes soliciting donations, sponsorships, or partnerships with business. Another common form of fundraising by schools is collecting school fees. What you're looking at here is an excerpt from a letter from my son's former high school. Many schools, like his, charge fees for clubs, agendas, sports teams, field trips, overnight trips, yearbooks, and so on. And again, looking at People for Education's research, they found in 2019 that 85% of secondary schools charged activity fees, ranging from $10 to $300 per student, with an average fee of $44. Of course, fundraised dollars don't just come from local families and communities. Some schools also compete for money through applying for grants. In 2019, People for Education surveys found that 83% of secondary schools received grants. And of those, 24% of the grants were awarded by businesses and 30% by philanthropies. At the elementary level, 75% reported that they received grants, and they're in this level, 17% from businesses and 18% from philanthropies. So, what are some of the problems with grants? Well, one is that the funder typically decides how money can be used. If your school needs some new musical instruments, but a grant only funds playgrounds, well, then you're out of luck. And also, grants may only be a one-time award. So if a school's needs are ongoing, then the funding sources have to be identified every year and reapplied for. Of course, applying for grants demands time and resources, including facility with English and French, knowledge of budgets, and persuasive writing. And like all forms of school fundraising, some schools have parents with these resources, but others don't. And in these cases, teachers or administrators may do the work, or it's not done at all. So it won't surprise many of you to know that not all schools are able to fundraise. And the difference in our abilities to fundraise through grants and other kinds of sources do create big variations in amounts collected by schools. So this graph shows variation in English school boards in the Greater Toronto area. And it's reported in the Toronto Star by Patty Winton in 2016. What you can see here is that York Catholic District School Board raised about $358 per elementary school student, whereas the Toronto District School Board raised an average of about $118 per student. And these school boards are literally across the street from each other. And what's more, the Toronto Catholic District School Board raised an average of almost $234 per student. And so that's nearly double the amount raised by those in the Toronto District School Board, two boards that are actually located in the very same geographical space. So, and fundraising can also contribute to variation within schools. A 2017 report from the Toronto District School Board showed that the amounts raised per student can vary by hundreds of dollars. And certainly the Toronto District School Board is not unique. People for Education's 2019 research also showed that in particular, schools in high socioeconomic areas fundraised twice as much as schools in low socioeconomic areas. So all these differences in school fundraising violate the public school ideal, first by creating unequal access to materials and opportunities for students. That includes things like technology, arts, library materials, guest speakers, field trips, and more. And furthermore, those students who do have access to those opportunities and materials, that comes at a price. They have to pay. And also importantly, fundraising really lets governments off the hook for adequately funding public education and normalizing the idea that private actors should be contributing funds as well. So I'm now going to turn to a strategy that many school districts use to raise money, and that is to host tuition-paying international students. In 2019, the Canadian Bureau for International Education reported that there were over 50,000 international students studying in Canada's public and private schools. And since international students don't meet residency requirements that entitle them to get education at no cost, they pay tuition. And tuition can cost upwards of $15,000 annually, making international students a very lucrative source of funding for boards, well, at least prior to the pandemic. So at that time, as of March 2020, we can say that the number of international students attending schools in Canada was increasing rapidly. For example, the number of international students in the Toronto Catholic District School Board increased almost tenfold in the 5 years between 2010-11 and 2015-16. Like other forms of fundraising, turning to tuition-paying students for funds to address government funding shortfalls allows governments to continue to underfund public education. But that's not all. According to research done by Wendy Poole and her colleagues at the University of British Columbia, they show that school boards are not equally able to attract international students and their tuition dollars. Their study of international student funding in BC's school districts found that urban districts typically generate more tuition funds than those in rural districts. And specifically, they showed that the 4 lowest tuition generating districts in their study, they were all in rural boards, and the 4 least earning actually did not generate any tuition at all. However, on the other side, the highest 4 boards added between 8 and 18% to the amounts that they received per student from the government. So of course, this means that some districts have a lot more money to spend on programs and resources for their students than others. And so then, like we saw with school-based fundraising, policies to attract international students can create inequities between boards as well. But turning to international students as a revenue source also privatizes public education in other ways. So as Poole and her colleagues explain, that when boards compete with each other for international students, their staff have to change how they work, and they have to think more like their counterparts in the private sector. There may be people who are hired or reassigned to develop marketing strategies and to recruit students. And these activities and these positions that are dedicated to international education may take resources away from domestic students and local education issues. Furthermore, boards might be encouraged to think about other boards as the competition and to prioritize their own constituents' needs over those of students, families, and staff in other boards. And as a consequence, the public interest served by boards in the education market becomes smaller and limited to people associated within a particular school board. Finally, I just want to highlight that the ideal of public schools serving the public interest is actually further diminished when you consider some of the key reasons that international students report that they choose to study in Canada. That is that they, one, hope to boost their career prospects in the global marketplace, and also to improve their chances of getting into their preferred university. So Canada's public education then is viewed as a commodity that offers private benefits to those who can buy it. So this is the very antithesis to the public idea of public education that prioritizes the public good. My last example of privatization of public education, and there's lots more that I could point to if I had more time, but I'm going to consider a policy that has changed how schools are governed, and that is policies to create charter schools. So charter schools are only in Alberta. They have a particular mandate. They're supposed to adopt a different approach to teaching that is going to or hopes to improve student achievement. They have to, they do receive the same funding as regular public schools. However, they may have admission criteria and they may charge fees. And in particular, they're not governed by democratically elected school boards. Instead, they're governed by a charter board. So this is a group of people who represents the interests of the school itself. In the USA, where charter schools are quite widespread, the research on their impact on student achievement is mixed, but they generally find that students in charter schools actually don't do better academically than kids in regular public schools. However, the research does show that charter schools tend to segregate kids along race, language, and class lines, and may leave poor and racialized students in schools with fewer resources and lower academic achievement. Now, charter schools were first introduced in 1994 in Alberta, and they were capped at 15. However, in 2019, the Bill 8, the Education Amendment Act, removed the limit on charter schools. So here we can see some evidence that the province was supporting increased privatization through expanding the number of charter schools prior to the pandemic. And then in 2020, in the early days of the pandemic, its government introduced the Choice in Education Act, again, facilitating the expansion of charter schools. And in this case, it was changed, among other changes, it changed the process by which charters are approved. Now, charter applicants just appeal directly to government. Before they had to, their public school boards had an opportunity to consider whether they wanted to adopt the proposed approach to education as part of their public school system. So an increase of charter schools sets the condition for more public funds to be spent out of the public's full view or by democratically elected officials, and creates more opportunities for students to be segregated from children unlike themselves. But of course, charter schools are also part of efforts to create markets in public education. And just a brief reminder, based on the design of markets in the private sector, in an education market, families choose between schools and school programs based on their preferences and resources, or at least that's the idea. And then when the funding that is sort of attached to the student, so a student is funded at a particular rate, when a student chooses a school, some or all of the public funding goes to that school of choice from basically the public funding follows the student. And so therefore, the more students that attend a school, the more money that the school receives. Now, supporters of education markets as a reform strategy argue that the need to compete for students will force schools to improve and to customize their offerings, which will enhance the overall quality of schools. In theory, the school choice policies should allow all families to participate, but in fact, researchers have shown that many children have been unable to access these programs, and that instead, school choice policies generally offer benefits to already advantaged children, and they also increased segregation between groups of students. So let's look at a few more policies under the banner of school choice. So one of the policies, we've talked about charter schools. Another policy is that of open enrollment. And this is when policies that allow kids to attend schools that are outside their neighborhoods, but within their school district. That's kind of one version of open enrollment. Some governments, BC, Alberta, Manitoba, require that there be open enrollment between school districts across the province where space and other conditions allow. But research shows that not all families are equally likely or able to take advantage of open enrollment policies. And researchers in the USA show that families tend to, those who do choose schools, they tend to choose ones that have higher student achievement and lower percentages of students from low-income backgrounds, minority students, students with limited English proficiency, and students in special education programs. They also show that it's more affluent students who are more likely to choose schools outside their district. And furthermore, the research shows that parents tend to choose schools that are attended by kids like their kids. That means that both the chosen and the not chosen schools actually become more socially stratified and less racially diverse. And this is problematic for a few reasons, including that research that shows that all children benefit from being in diverse classrooms. Being in classrooms with kids whose perspectives and backgrounds are different from their own. This kind of diversity in classrooms promotes creativity, motivation, deeper learning, and critical thinking and problem-solving skills. Another policy that is very popular in some places, some districts across the country, although certainly not everywhere, is that of offering specialized schools and programs. So these are schools or whole schools or programs within schools that offer something special in addition to the regular school program. This something might be a particular curriculum focus like arts or science, athletics. It could be an accelerated pace of learning. It could be an academic program such as the International Baccalaureate or advanced placement courses. Could be an alternative pedagogical approach. Importantly, a lot of specialized schools and programs require kids to complete applications. They may have to write entrance exams, sit for interviews, or audition for a limited number of spaces. Securing a spot in these specialized schools and programs often demands knowledge of deadlines, program expectations. You need to have funding to get there because transportation costs normally aren't provided, and there has to be money. Families must have money to cover additional fees that normally are part of specialized programs. So, like, for example, there was a specialized athletic program offered by a school board in Ontario in 2019, which charged kids $30 to apply. And if accepted, it was $350 for uniform, $100 for a program fee, $35 for an activity fee, and $30 for grade 9 orientation. And to be honest, I've seen fees at some specialized programs across the country that are literally go into the hundreds and thousands of dollars. Now, of course, some people would say, well, this is all optional. These kinds of programs are not required. And therefore, why shouldn't students pay the additional costs? But again, of course, first of all, I want to point out that idea that governments only need to provide the basics and that people who want more than the basics should be able to pay for it, that idea is very common in the public sector. Private sector, where sort of like a fee for service are very common. And like other policies that promote school choice, research shows that not all kinds of families are able to access the specialized programs. For example, in Vancouver, a study by Professor Isol Yoon and Lynn Daniels found that the city's Indigenous students are less likely to attend specialized secondary school programs than their non-Indigenous peers. So they found that while Indigenous students at the time of their study made up 3% of the board's secondary school population, only 1% of selective programs students were Indigenous. Indigenous students were even underrepresented at the specialized program at the high school that had the highest proportion of Indigenous children in the board. Looking across the country at Toronto, Ruben Gaztambide Fernandez and Jillian Perec study of specialized arts programs found that more than half of the incoming classes at some of these programs came from the highest income brackets in the Toronto District School Board. And furthermore, that white students were overrepresented in these programs. I also, finally, in some specialized schools and programs, some kids, not only do they not get in, they're actually not welcome. So, for example, there's a school in Montreal that says that applicants cannot have failed any courses the year before. They must be proficient in English or French. and it limits the number of students with special needs that it will accept, and there are certain exceptionalities that it will not accept at all. So these kinds of programs, certainly not all of them, but the ones that have entrance criteria, fees, or don't accept all children, they violate the public school ideals commitments to accessible and free education. I want to turn now to another policy. Again, doesn't exist across the country, but that's a policy that funds private school with public money. Currently only 5 provinces have a policy like that. And I want to point out that, these policies were not necessarily introduced with the intent to privatize or to create markets in education through school choice. That's a more recent sort of phenomenon. However, a lot of advocates of public funding for private schools today actually do call for public funds to flow to private schools for precisely that reason. Now, in some places, the amount of funding that has been allocated to private schools has increased over time. So looking at the case of Alberta, when it was some private schools were first funded in 1967, each school received $100 per student per year that met a set of conditions. But in 1974, that amount was increased to 33% of that public schools board received per student. 1976, it was increased to 40%. 1998, the amount most private schools received went up to 60%. And since 2008, most received 70% of what public schools get per student. So you can see in this case a trend or trajectory of increase of public funding flowing to private schools on a per student basis, a percentage per student. Policies that fund private schools with public dollars don't benefit everyone equally, and they don't support the public school ideal. First, research demonstrates that families with higher incomes are more likely to choose private schools than those with low incomes. Certainly, some private schools still charge some tuition. None of the provinces that fund private schools fund them at 100%. So if your families, if they can't afford those sort of additional costs, even private schools with some government funding remain out of reach of those families. So that means that these policies expect that individuals from lower income backgrounds to pay taxes that are used to subsidize private schools, when in fact those families are the least likely to use them. Now, let's say for a minute that money was not an issue. Everyone could afford the costs, or that funding was at 100%. There's still another problem related to access for many private schools, and that is private schools are able to select their students according to their own criteria. Unlike public schools and the public school ideal, private schools are able to turn students away, those who don't fit for some reason. They may have certain needs that school feels they can't meet. They may struggle academically. They may speak a language other than the languages of instruction, or have values that are different from those that are espoused by the school. Now in Ontario, struggles for public funding of private schools are long-standing. That's one of the things I'm investigating in my current research study. And advocates for public funding of private schools haven't yet been successful. However, throughout the past few years during the pandemic, we've seen some moments when the current Ford government has actually given payments directly to parents to use as they please, including to buy computers, tutoring, or whatever they choose. So here's the question. Is this the start of vouchers in Ontario? I'm not the first to ask that. I've seen other people asking that question. The term vouchers refers to different kinds of programs that ultimately they are about giving parents a certain amount of money to spend on the school of their choice. So the money may flow directly to parents, or it could flow via school choice, as I said before, to the school that the parent selects. I mean, in some places in the United States, there's even there's an education savings account that parents receive, and then their choice, the tuition for if they choose to use it at whatever school they choose to use it at, private, public, it's subtracted from their account. So, and also vouchers can also be used in some places to support homeschooling. Just sort of as I mentioned, voucher programs are increasingly common throughout the United States. And in fact, over the last few years, a lot of states have either introduced or expanded voucher programs during the pandemic. So like other people, I'm wondering if Ontario's current Ford government may be using the pandemic to sort of ease vouchers into the system. And as I mentioned earlier, research shows that private solutions offered during a crisis have a tendency to stick around. So finally, let's talk about e-learning as an option in education markets. This is really the wheelhouse of my colleague, Dr. Behan Farhadi. We've done some research together recently, and I've learned a lot from her. I'm going to draw on that and point to some of her other work as well. So in terms of e-learning, this option's been around, for many decades in some places, but certainly it's expanded and it's changed. Since the districts began offering online programs in the 1990s in some places. So in Ontario, the first province-wide strategy was introduced in 2006. And among other things, the strategy involved licensing a learning management system. It's now called D2L Brightspace. For some of my educators out there, that might ring a bell. Anyways, this learning management system was to be used by school boards. However, it was stipulated that boards could not use them to offer fully virtual schools or to offer courses using them as a way to generate revenue. Now, when the strategy was introduced and shortly following that, only a small percentage of students actually enrolled in e-learning courses. 2013 survey found that principals reported only 3% of their students were participating in e-learning, although 90% of schools had at least one student involved. Now, Dr. Farhadi's research investigated online learning by students who chose to take courses online as part of their regular programs in the Toronto District School Board. This was prior to the pandemic. Her research found that the students who took e-learning courses by choice were more likely to be in schools that had advantages, meaning low levels of poverty, compared to other schools in the board. She noted that most of the courses that were offered through e-learning were actually targeted towards students who were aiming to go to university, and that students formerly identified as gifted were overrepresented in the groups of students that chose these courses. And her research showed that already advantaged students in the Toronto District School Board used supplementary e-learning as a strategy to accrue individual benefits, that is higher grades or the opportunities to pursue extracurricular experiences that they then could use to secure advantages in competitions for university acceptances. You may recall, some of you, that in 2019, Ontario's progressive conservative government introduced a number of reforms related to e-learning, including the requirement that students complete 4 e-learning courses to graduate. Concerns raised at the time by many educators, teachers, and researchers, and supported by Dr. Farhadi's research and others' research as well, including the very limited research that was available on mandatory e-learning in Michigan. This research showed that only 55% of kids passed courses that were offered online. The pass rates for students in poverty was almost 20% less than those not in poverty. And that students who struggled in regular classes also struggled in online courses unless there were good support systems in place to help the students out. And as also part of the 2019 reform to education, including online learning, Ontario's Ford government announced a new rule for TVO. That is to centralize the delivery of all e-learning courses for the province, and to consider look for ways to monetize e-learning outside Ontario through its distance learning program. That is, the government set out its intention to investigate the possibility of selling Ontario's public education abroad. As we're all too well familiar with, the pandemic brought a shift to online learning that made a lot of the challenges plain, as well as others, including the problem of unequal access to technology and to the internet, the need for some students to have an adult around to supervise, and the need for supports for students with certain kinds of learning needs where needed and often not available. So now in Ontario, there's a requirement. The requirement went from 4 now to 2 courses. That requirement that students complete 2 online courses remains in order to graduate, although there is an opt-out provision. And in March 2021, under the cover of the pandemic, there was a leaked confidential document that contained new proposals for consultations for e-learning policy in Ontario. And this document suggested that the government was looking to make virtual learning a permanent choice in the province's education system. And it also intended to continue to pursue the commercialization of Ontario's public education. Like selling education to international students who come to Canada, selling public education abroad commodifies public education and contributes to the marketization of education on a global scale. Just to be clear, I'm not opposed to online learning as an option for students if it's a choice that's available to all students. I'm concerned, however, that it may serve as yet another option that enables already advantaged students to accrue more benefits from public education than their less advantaged peers. So just before wrapping up, I just want to take a few minutes to talk about how it's maybe possible to resist or continue to engage in efforts to resist education privatization. I know that there's some people on this call who are already very active, and yet there's other people who this may be the first time they've really put their mind to thinking about issues of education privatization. So one of the things you might do is just stay informed. There are organizations across the country who are committed to defending and strengthening public education. So for example, there's Support Our Students Alberta, People for Public Education Manitoba, People for Education Ontario, IPEBC, I think it's Institute for Public Education British Columbia. There are lots of free resources you might want to check out. So for example, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives publication of Our Schools Ourselves, you can access those for free online. There's a free journal of education policy called the Canadian Journal of Education Administration and Policy that also publishes research on not just education privatization, but a wide range of education policies. Certainly, you can ask critical questions. Even though in my book, I talk about how you might conduct a formal critical research policy study, you can certainly raise a lot of the same questions just in your conversations at schools, with elected officials, people running for office. Ask questions like, who does this policy benefit and how? Who's losing and how? How does this policy perpetuate or challenge unequal social relationships? Why was this policy created? Who participated in its creation? Those are just some examples you might ask. You can join the public dialogue. You're here tonight. You're already on your way if this is your first step. Other things you might do is write op-eds, letters to the editor, publish articles, write a blog, participate or create a podcast. You might share articles or books or documentaries or data through social media. You could host a conversation with friends or family to discuss them, maybe like a book club. You might ask a local parent council to host some kind of discussion with you. You should also be pretty clear what you're up against. There are a lot of people, organizations, and companies who stand to benefit and to profit from privatization in and of public education. You'll likely face resistance, but change is possible. For example, look, a lot of advocacy and careful consideration of data and looking at the has prompted the Toronto District School Board to change its policies related to access to specialized schools and programs. There was recently, and the date's slipping my mind, a parent in Quebec who fought back against school fees, and as a consequence of that case, the policy was changed, and in fact, some parents actually received checks, returned money from fees that were refunded. And I think also that you need to remember that, and you need to believe that the public school ideal is worth pursuing. I do believe that public schools are our country's best hope for achieving economic, social, and political justice. In large part, it's because it is, they are one of the few spaces where kids may get to know people that are very different from themselves and their families, people that are unlike them. Public schooling is based on the idea that every child is of equal worth and deserves the opportunity to realize all the benefits of education. And education privatization undermines this belief. Policies that adopt private sector practices, such as creating marketplaces through school choice policies and charging fees, they exacerbate social inequality by segregating students and creating unequal schools in terms of resources and opportunities. I don't believe that kids can learn to value equality, inclusion, and fairness if they attend public schools that exclude some of their peers, or if they themselves are shut out of opportunities, or if they observe that some kids are able to get advantages in public schools that are not available to everyone. This hidden curriculum teaches that some people are more socially valued or deserving than others, and that's okay. In privatized systems, public schools become places where families get what they can for their own children and where historical and social inequalities are reproduced, all at the public's expense. We need schools that reflect the public school ideal in order to achieve a socially just society that benefits us all. Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett's research in the book, The Spirit Level, shows that more equal societies benefit everyone. They're healthier, they enjoy higher quality social relationships, they have lower rates of social problems, including lower homicide rates, lower rates of imprisonment, lower use of illegal drugs than less equal society. We need to demand that our governments fully fund public education, and elected officials need to pursue the public school ideal through policy. There needs to be an ongoing analysis of the impact of policies on different groups of students. When a policy is shown to create or reproduce inequities or otherwise threaten the public school ideal, it must be abandoned. And I believe that we need to start by abandoning education privatization. So I want to thank you all for listening. Here's my email address. Love to hear from you. This is the cover of my new book, hot off the press, where I go into a lot more detail, where you can find the citations of people's work that I've referenced throughout this evening, and you can find it at the University of Toronto Press. So thank you very much. And I'm really pleased that my colleague, Dr. Behan Farhadi, is here to join us to participate in facilitating the question and answers.
Thank you very much, Sue, for a really thought-provoking, sweeping analysis of the landscape, the troubling landscape that we find ourselves in. And you've, I'm sure, provoked a great number of questions. I'm struck by the power of your analysis and the strength of your conclusions as you draw them there. So I'm looking forward to seeing and hearing the questions. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Behan Farhadi. Dr. Farhadi is a research cluster lead for community engagement and public scholarship at the Institute for Research on Digital Literacies at York University, and a research associate with the Centre for Policy Alternatives in Ontario. She also teaches at the Toronto District School Board and is an advocate for a fully funded anti-oppressive public education system. Dr. Farhadi has most recently studied educational policy enactment in secondary schools with Dr. Sue Winton during her 2-year tenure as a postdoctoral visitor in the Faculty of Education. And they continue to publish their findings most recently in the Canadian Journal of Educational Administration and Policy, which is the journal I think you referenced towards the end of your presentation, wasn't it, Sue? So thank you once again. Dr. Farhadi, I shall pass over to you at this point.
Thank you, and thank you for that introduction. And I've been sort of looking at the questions. We've got many and enough to fill the remainder of this talk. I wanted to start by thanking you, Dr. Winton, for your presentation, for addressing a really important gap in research that I've struggled with in terms of like representing the context of privatization in Canada, highlighting variation across and within provinces, and noting the impact particularly on education policies. So to start, I just wanted to ask where the audience can find the information and references that you cited. Is it available in your book? And while you're answering that, I'll take a look at the other questions.
Hi, yes, thank you. Certainly in the book, tonight's talk I've drawn from the book, and yes, the citations are available throughout the book. There are some that may be paywalled, behind, speaking of education privatization, maybe through academic journals, in which case just reach out to me. And in the book, not only, can you find what I talked about tonight, but I also talk about other policies that I didn't have time to talk about tonight, including homeschooling, and policies that are present in some school boards that enable families to use their private resources to access things outside the school that they then are able to bring into the school to accrue benefits. So, for example, policies that enable families to pay for private psychological assessments and then bring those results into the school. Policies, opportunities for sometimes families will buy individual credits at private schools and then have those individual credits applied to their public school. So I talk about those policies. I talk about waiver policies. I also spend some time, a chapter introducing critical policy research. How is it different than, sort of traditional policy studies? And then, like I said, I first, those people who are interested in carrying out their own research, I have an appendix that talks about how to design a critical policy research study.
Thank you. And just to let the audience know that some of the questions are really similar. So if you kind of hear your question reframed, it's to synthesize it. So the next question, you're getting lots of fantastic talks, so I wanted to pass that along. Thank you for your excellent presentation. This audience member says, how aware do you think the public is on privatization and public education? Do you think that this agenda is overlooked or underestimated? And I know that you referenced a bit about the strategies for raising awareness as well at the end.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think that a lot of people are very busy and they're not aware of how their individual acts as parents or families or teachers sort of connects into these larger systemic issues that reproduce or produce social inequality. One of the reasons I do think that is because through all my interviews with people who work closely with policies that privatize, I'm thinking in particular, my research around school fundraising. Certainly, they know, they're aware. I've talked to school council chairs or the book fair coordinator. They seem to be aware, but they themselves feel that their parent community or their school community are not aware. I also think that, like I started off by saying, that I think that when people hear privatization, they don't think of sort of the whole wide range of ways that privatization manifests within public school. They may have a tendency to think private schools or like wholesale change. And so I think that that's another factor that makes me think that they're not so aware. And also, I think that point about the scaling up privatization, about how it sort of happened over time, is can help to also explain why I do think that a lot of people are not as aware of how these various policies are privatizing the public systems writ large.
Thank you. This next one is really interesting to me as well. I think about it a lot, and it reminds me of a tweet I recently saw about once we shift away from the public system, we can't go back. It's real harder to come back. And this question really talks about the realities Black parents experience in the schooling system, the anti-Black racism, the harm, and what it means that Black parents are choosing private schools to address those needs and the shortcomings of the public system. So the question really is asking to talk about the connection between social and economic struggle, schooling and economic realities, and sort of like that tension between what does it mean to advocate for a system that is in some ways, as you've referenced, I think, producing harm.
Yeah, I'm just taking down some notes. It's a really important question. And so I'm going to think about that question. You said, for example, Black families choosing private schools. I know in my book that I've talked about and looked at research that looks at, for example, Black families choosing homeschooling as an option, as a way of sort of preserving, finding a safe space for their child and using it as a means for escaping racism. And I think in your study, Dr. Farhadi, you found that students themselves also reported that. So a couple of things, I'm going to sort of say a few things, and if you want to add anything or correct what I say, please do. So I think one of the things that this question really brings up is the difference between individual choices that parents and students make for themselves and for their families, and what motivates them, and what are the outcomes of them for as individuals or members of groups. And then also, what is the responsibility of the public system to think sort of more broadly? So I think that when a person exits the public system, whether they go to homeschooling or private schooling, I understand what motivates, in some cases, those decisions. What I want to point out, though, is it doesn't do anything to change the system that they exit. So for those individuals or families that are unable to leave, the problems remain. So again, there's that individual piece there. So that's why I think that we need to think systemically as a public education system. So there's like the short-term view, and then there's the long-term view. So I understand that people are going to make the short-term decisions, especially when it comes to safety and feeling and knowing that you're represented and valued, and that you're achieving, that you are accessing something that will benefit you. But I think that the system has a responsibility. By the system, I mean those of us who are citizens that want something better for all of our students, all of our kids, so that families don't feel that they must leave public education in order to find these safer spaces for themselves, or spaces where they don't have experienced racism or other forms of discrimination. So I don't want to, but I also don't want to put it on you. You decide, individual parent, what's good for your child. I mean, that is sort of the idea of school choice more generally. And what that does is it kind of recreates this idea that it's all about what the individual chooses, and that there isn't a responsibility on behalf of society and public education. And I don't agree with that. I don't know if you also, I won't speak for you, but if you wanted to say a few things about what you found about online courses when students made the choice to leave, for example, because they experienced racism.
Yeah, I mean, we live in an anti-Black society, right? And we're going to see, I think, like these dynamics reproduced in our public system. And I think that there's like the next question, which I think really nicely captures this tension between the promise of public education, the ideal of the public, that it's worth fighting for, as it's worth fighting for social justice in society, and recognizing that the realities that families are confronting are forcing them to make often impossible choices for their kids. And not everybody has the option, as you said, I think, to pursue that. And that the considerations of an individual family, to me, is super distinct from, as you noted, from the responsibility of the system. And so there's less to me, and I think I'm echoing what you're saying, there's less to me this kind of turning toward like messaging toward individual choices, and more toward calling to account the democratically instituted systems that are responsible for public schooling, to which children have a right to access, no matter their access to resources. And so, yeah, I think I just want to like name that tension as something that we're many people I know in this talk, like who are attendees, are actively living and sort of sitting in as well. And so that really does sort of go into that next question of this is kind of like two people ask this question in different ways. So we have this ideal of the public school that you reference, right? And it feels in some ways, especially relative to the results of so much of research on public education, impossible to meet. Are there examples of public institutions or services that approach this ideal? And this is maybe a more philosophical question, so like pick whatever thread works for you. What does it mean if we don't meet this ideal? And in short, what is your thoughts on the relationship between this ideal and a reality that might not be achieved? It's a really big question.
Yeah, that's a big question, but it also reminds me of sort of the philosophical, theoretical position that I have as I come to this study, and that is the ideal of critical democracy, even in and of itself. And I think that's sort of that's kind of the point, that it's an ideal. You never really achieve it. It's something you're always working towards, because of course the world's not the same today as it was yesterday. I'm not the same as I was, half an hour ago. I'm a lot calmer now. So where things are always changing, and so we all. In a critical democratic ideal, like in the pursuit of the public school ideal, it demands ongoing revisiting of what's happening, what's the best decision we can make now, what has to happen next, so that and without this idea that like there is a place that we'll get to and it'll always be the same and the needs won't change, because we know that's not true. We know that the world's always changing. Our way of understanding the world is also changing. Our actual physical world is changing. So I think that we pursue it as an ideal. I think that, what does it mean if we can't meet it? Well, I don't think it means like we just give up, because I think we've seen in places, I'm going to look to the US where there is a lot of research available, but it's certainly not limited to the US, where, there was an idea where like, what, public schools aren't achieving, doing very well for, and I'm going to think in the case of, for example, for African-American students and other racialized students in the US, where, 20, 30 years ago, there was a lot of support for trying different things, charter schools and other kinds of school choice policies, because public schools were clearly not serving all well. But now, looking a few decades later, the evidence has demonstrated that, in fact, it hasn't really addressed those issues. In some ways, it's exacerbated them, and you're seeing a lot of communities pushing back. So, I mean, it's something for society to wrestle with, and I think this also reminds me of the question before, that this is not just the responsibility of parents. This is what I think about our parents who have kids in schools. Like, this is the responsibility of everyone in society, parent or otherwise, current or former parent like myself. My children are no longer in public schools. Doesn't matter. Like, I'm not done with them. I still have a responsibility to the other people with whom I live. So I want to, as a society, I think it's important to continue to try to pursue the ideal. And when the evidence demonstrates that it's not working for maybe it's not going to work for everyone always, but we don't want to start with the most advantage that working for them. Let's start with the least advantage and start from that as a starting point. When it's not working, then we need to revisit what we've been doing.
Yeah, and I think that that's the kind of like central tenet of equity-driven policies, right? Like who we're centering in our work. And it's this next question is also kind of interesting in the framing of how we talk about this ideal. So currently, public discourse seems to be framed in relative to our greatest fears. So how do we have a conversation in this environment? And I think implicit in this is like, how do we reframe this aim toward like these ideals and aspirations that we need to really gather around?
Yeah, that question, I hope I answer it. You could ask me again in another way if I don't answer it well enough. But that makes me think about is, to be honest, I'm in the midst of conceptualizing a new project with colleagues, new public education advocates and supporters. And when we were meeting initially to have a conversation about, what was this project going to look like? Of course, we're focusing on education privatization. And one of my colleagues, Lena Parker, she said, maybe we should think about what we're fighting for as opposed to defending against. And I feel like in some ways that is what your question is kind of getting at, or what this question is kind of getting at. I think that fears are really important and actually relevant to this conversation. I think that we are constantly part of a broader societal discourse where we hear and we see that there's widening gap between rich and poor, and that there's not as much to go around, and we know that there isn't, and that the climate crisis and pandemic. So of course there's a lot of fear around us. I think that this is though where we need to return to thinking about like, what do we value? How do we pursue it? Why do we think it's a good idea? And I think in terms of this question around how well aware are people about the issue, privatization and the problems, I think it also kind of touches on this question of like, how do we persuade people to change practices and policies, especially when they may be part of the groups that are actually benefiting from them. But I think in part it comes to recognize that fear that I think does drive choices that families might make, or that students make, and recognize that where it's coming from, recognizing that people were fear of making a mistake for our kids, we're fear of making judgment from others, and so I think that how do we change the discourse? I think in part we talk about celebrations, when we can, we talk about achievements, we look at successes. I mean, we just had a really big success in Ontario this past week, where the public came together to say, no, we're not willing to have that. It's not good. Maybe good. I may not be a member of QB, but this isn't good for society. This is not good for any of us. And so I think that we need to celebrate those kinds of moments as well, and see that they can happen, and that they do happen. Even though sometimes it feels like they're fewer and far between than we'd like.
What I love about these questions and these answers is like, it's never satisfying, right? Like we just have to hold these kinds of tensions. But I think, like, to your point, like holding an ideal toward which we're aiming our action. This question is a bit broad, so I'm not sure. And if the person who asked it wants to say more, they can. And if you want to sort of interpret it in ways that make sense to you, but I think they wanted to understand how public money, or can you say more about how public money is being used to fund private schools?
I know the cases of Alberta the best, just because that's one of the case studies in my current research. So just generally speaking, on a very broad strokes, there are, in the provinces that fund private schools, there, like I said, there's 5, and generally, and again, there's variation between, but not all private schools are the same. There may be categories of private schools. And then depending on what category your school falls under, and again, those categories are constructed differently in different provinces, then those schools would receive a certain percentage of the amount that is funded per student, not for all costs. I have to say, like there's some costs that aren't covered that they would get. So like I said, in Alberta, some schools get 70 or 80%, some get 60 or so there's certainly some variation. But at the same time, there are other ways that public funding supports private schools, other than just sort of the direct shift of percentage of per student amounts. And that goes to things like in some places, you're able to claim a childcare tax credit for like the lunchtime supervision. Some schools don't have to pay property taxes. So there's other kinds of ways that public money supports private schools. And I have to say, not all private schools want or accept public money, because oftentimes there are conditions that schools have to agree to in order to receive the public funds. And they include things like teaching an approved curriculum or hiring teachers that have been trained by or certified by a provincial certifying board. So there is variation for sure. And yeah, so I think I'll stop there.
Okay, I'm mindful that we have just a few more minutes, and there's one more question that seems really interesting to me that you didn't talk about that I'm going to throw out there. So if to the degree you can answer it. So this is, I think this is someone who's asking in the context of Alberta, there's privatization is both subtly and overtly driven by religious interests that want to secure public funding, and the dissemination of kind of Republican United States fear-mongering about wokeism, gender ideology, CRT. And I think that this is kind of one iteration that intersects with the sphere of the religious, but it's not entirely, the singular sphere. And I know you've done research looking at the relationship between religious motivations and privatization. So to the degree that you want to say more about that, that'll be the last question.
Yeah, sure. I really hate to say like, oh, look at my latest article, but I have to say that I do have an article available with my co-researcher, Steve Staples, who I know is on this call. And what we did was we did look at Alberta and we looked at advocacy for public funding of private schools. And one of the things that we found, just sort of like as I could hear you framing the question, is exactly what we found, which is that people who advocate for public funding of private schools in Alberta and elsewhere, they don't necessarily agree. They don't necessarily share the reasons for why they want to have that public funding. So you're right. Some are motivated by the belief that they should, that public just means public funding, and that they should have the ability to educate their child at however they want. And some of those people, for some it's from a religious perspective, and for some it's philosophical. It's not only religious. Now, they may be the same or they may be different from those people who argue it as a reform strategy, as a way to improve schooling, public schooling and other kinds of schooling. So they're not necessarily the same group, absolutely. And so I wouldn't want to conflate them, even though their overall storyline, as we say in our research study, is private schools deserve public funding. So again, you can, that article is freely available. Just send me a note, or it's in the Education Policy Analysis archives. And finally, just the one point you mentioned about CRT as an example, I'm going to give a shout out to some other researchers of a podcast that's called Have You Heard? And it's in the US, and I'm going to defer to them, but they had an interesting guest whose name escapes me at this moment, but the guest was pointing out that they were arguing that, like I said earlier, that, those advocating of vouchers and school choice really have not been able to point to much better student achievement outcomes. That sort of rationale hasn't held up. And so this author was suggesting that the claim to, the reason that we might want to have school choices so that we can choose schools whose values are more like ours, or enables us to choose an education that is more like the kind of education we want, and sort of the downplaying of claims for improved schools or student achievement. So I think I will leave it there.
Thank you so much. And we're right at the end. I'll throw it to Dr. Savage. Appreciate all the engagement from the audience, and apologies to any questions I didn't get. There were a couple.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fahadi, and thank you once again, Dr. Sue Winton. And finally, thank you to everybody who's attended today. And lots of names, some of them I recognise. There are many folk there from all sorts of different communities. I'm glad we've been able to have an event like this today to draw people to this important topic. And to be thinking so closely about it. So thank you once again. Thank you for all the great questions that went in there, and a particular thanks once again to you, Dr. Sue Winton, for a really, really thought-provoking and important presentation this evening. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for coming. I look forward to continuing the conversation.